Welcome to the Thinking Theologically podcast, where we teach you how and why you should think theologically. I am back to hosting now, Spencer Shaw. If you remember, we did a little hiatus from spiritual realm stuff, and then we went back to kind of more of our traditional format, but we're back to spiritual realm stuff. So I'm hosting, and that means that I'm joined by Jack Dodgen. Jack, how are you doing?
Good. I can actually like wave and say hello and stuff. We uploaded a video where I had a conversation with somebody, and while we haven't given people a lot of time to respond to it just yet, nobody was revolted that my face was on screen. So we're like, what if we do this some more? So here we are. But now I don't know what to do with like my hands and stuff, and I need to clean my bookshelves, and oh well. But I'm good.
Yeah,
I'm good. I'm glad to be here.
So yeah, you mentioned some of you may be watching the video version of this, which is our first video of a normal podcast. We've done the interviews like that, which was kind of my thought process. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure if I ever told Jack my thought process, but my thought process was start with that and kind of figure out the whole, because going video is a whole different ball game, just because you've got to learn, no matter how good you are with technology, when you're learning a new software or something like that, you've got to, there's little things that you have to tweak. So my thought process was, let's figure that out, and then maybe we can move to video stuff. And now with the rise of AI, it's so much easier because there's not a whole lot of editing and stuff you have to do anymore. So it makes it easy to just say, hey, let's video record and let computers put it all together, and then we post it. So here we are. Hopefully you're watching this video. I don't know, things could mess up between now and the end, but hopefully this is the new little addition to the podcast, is having some video content, which is on our YouTube channel, Thinking Theologically. So go check that out, as well as our website, thinkingtheologically.org. Find us on all social media. I'll remind you about that at the end of the episode as well. So as I said, we're entering back into our conversation on spiritual realm, unseen realm things. If you've been with us for the last a few episodes, I don't know how many we've done now. Is this number 4?
I think this is 70. I think this is 70 overall. Sorry, not spiritual realm. Spiritual realm. I think this is like 5. 70th episode. Yeah, 5th spiritual realm, I think.
So we've done 4-ish episodes on the spiritual realm. 70 episodes apparently overall. We're getting close to the 100th at some point, which we'll have to do something special when that comes. Anyway, so this is where we've been so far on unseen realm, spiritual realm things. We've focused in on 3 different events from the book of Genesis, beginning with the fall in Genesis 3. We talked about fallen spiritual beings that are influencing Adam and Eve. We talked about this serpent imagery. We probably talked about it a little bit differently than maybe you've heard it talked about before, or at least introduced some different ways of thinking about that story. But we see spiritual beings influencing God's creation there in Genesis 3. If you're familiar with the Genesis story, then you know that everything kind of goes downhill from there very, very quickly. And so the next point that we looked at is the flood in Genesis 6. We talked about fallen spiritual beings influencing many people in the world and creating physical manifestations of evil to further corrupt the creation. We introduced the idea of the Nephilim. We talked about fallen angels there intermarrying with human beings and their offspring being the giants of old, the Nephilim. At least we talked about that's the way that later Jews interpreted it, and it seems to at least loosely fit in with the rest of the evidence that we have in Scripture, spiritual realm, as we're going to continue to talk about. A brief side note, just to say that as most things that we talk about, there is more than one way to understand these things. And there's bits and pieces that you can be like, no, and it still works. You could say no to angels in Genesis 6. That doesn't negate some of the other Nephilim spiritual realm language that we see necessarily. So I know different people that understand these things in different ways. And so I just wanted to throw that out there you don't have to disregard the whole because you're not on board with one aspect of what we're talking about. That's true for the rest of your life as well. So maybe we can all learn something there. That was what our last episode was about. Well, before the interview. So the last normal episode.
Our last normal one. That was like 2 hours long.
And then the third story that we looked at the last time we were talking about spiritual realm was the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, the continued influence of evil in the world, causing God's creation to disregard his commands and to try to make a name for themselves. And so in Genesis, we've seen not only this buildup of evil, this downhill spiral, but the role that spiritual beings, fallen beings, have played in the downward spiral of humanity. That now leads us in to have a deeper discussion in this episode on the Nephilim. So, Jack, I will turn it over to you to introduce to us in a deeper way this concept of the Nephilim that we've been introduced to just briefly earlier.
So I'll say from the top of this, there's going to be way more info on the show notes than I'll actually say out loud. So definitely check those things out on thinkingtheologically.org because the Word document for the show notes was 8 pages long. A lot of that is just verses that are compiled, and I wanted them to be there. I used this for a class that I taught, so I didn't want people to have to jump around all the time in their Bible because people will typically just close their Bible if they have to jump too much. So I had all the verses there. We'll read some of them, but a lot of them will be left just in the notes. Definitely check these things out because there's a lot of info there. I want to say a few things about the Nephilim. The first being they go by many names. When we encounter the Nephilim in Genesis 6, we kind of have a tendency to go, that's weird, and then we drop them, and the Bible does not drop them. They continue to show up as a thread throughout various other places, very intentionally as a thread. And we'll look, that's the focus of our lesson today, is where the thread picks up and who's dealing with these things and all of that. But we tend to just kind of move on from it and go, well, whatever we think that it is, it's not all that big of a deal. We talked about how in the tower, you seem to have an individual Nimrod who is presented there, and he's connected to these things, probably is one of these things, and he's leading this rebellion is the implication, and leading the rebellion in various places that will be problems moving forward. Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, all sorts of places. And then we immediately deal with Babel in the chapter after he's introduced. But these things go by many names, and they exist for a while as we go throughout Old Testament history. I want to start with Numbers 13, 32 through 33. So they brought the people of Israel a bad report out of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. We're given descriptors of both this is what they look like to us, and this is how we feel within their presence, the great height and the grasshoppers thing. But we're also given this connector in the parentheses here, the sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim. The text calls them Nephilim, but they're like this specific group. And what we're getting is these things that exist in this place connected back to this stuff from Genesis 6. And so as they're going into the promised land, they encounter these things, and for them, it's this clear connection back to these things back there that led in rebellion. So we'll start with that first kind of term. You have Nephilim, we get Anakim, the sons of Anak. When you read Deuteronomy 1, and we won't, but it's in the notes here, you get this phrase, the sons of the Anakim are there. But you get this note in Deuteronomy 2, 10 and 11. The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites called them Emim. You get like 2 verses of, hey, let me fill you in on what's happening here, what's going on. And we get multiple names. We get Anakim, who we know are connected to Nephilim in terms, as well as Rephaim, which we'll talk about more in a moment. And then you get Emim, E-M-I-M, and it's specifically noted as this is what the Moabites call these things. And we'll have more to say about that, but to, I guess, spoil it a little bit, these things were so known and recognized and prevalent at one point in time that they had dialectical terms used for them. So different regions would call them by different names, and we have more stuff on that here in a minute. The third term, the big one, is Rephaim. So as you're reading through the Old Testament, you're going to encounter 3 big terms: Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim. Those are not the only names, but those are the 3 most prominent. This is what they are, or it's all referring to the same thing. Deuteronomy 2, 10 through 11, we just read, connects Anakim and Rephaim together. We already saw Anakim and Nephilim connected together, so just through... that's not a syllogism, right? That's not exactly what that is, but they're all connected. A equals B equals C, and so C equals A as well. They're noted in Genesis 14 as being kings and involved in war all the time, which is what you would expect. You have these giant, massive things leading rebellion. They're the ones, whether you want to vote for them or not, right? They're the ones that are going to be in charge. They're the biggest thing around. You're going to follow them, do what they tell you to do, and they led in war and rebellion and everything that's anti-God. They're not about peace. They're not about all the nations being together. They're about separating and building cities and conquering one another. Deuteronomy 3 also gives us reference to the land of the Rephaim, and in Joshua and Samuel and Chronicles and even Isaiah, we get reference to the valley of the Rephaim. So what I want us to see with all of these terms is that prevalence. Spencer and I have talked about this multiple times of, is there one evil thing? No. There are all of these beings that exist, and this goes like not just one spiritual evil thing sitting back and pulling all the strings. No, there's a bunch of those. And in addition to that, there's also a bunch of these physical manifestations of those problems at this time, walking around, leading people astray, and all of this. So you have very physically this presence of what Paul will later call the powers. They have a physical presence on the earth at this time, I think is the best way to think of that. Like I said before, and again, this is in your notes, plenty of other terms. Emim, we already read. Kaphtorim, and let's see, Zamzumim, Avim, and there's more. In the notes, you'll actually see how those names are connected to our big 3, either Nephilim, Anakim, or Rephaim. And so we just have these things everywhere, leading all these other nations astray, causing them to move further and further away from God. This matters when we come into Joshua and the text there about how far the nations have gone. Well, who's pulling them in that direction? Well, there's stuff that's actually leading them astray and moving them further away from God. And those things need to be dealt with. And so when we come into Joshua, some of the conquest texts and things like that, God's dealing with this evil. And he's doing it on purpose. And we'll deal with that in our summary here in just a moment. You'll also have notes about how other cultures have stuff about Nephilim or giants within their various stories and writings, just kind of lending a little bit more to, it's not just the Bible that points to the existence of these things, it's also other ancient Near Eastern texts that point to this stuff, the Epic of Gilgamesh being the most prominent of those things in Mesopotamia, but you have Greece and Egypt and all of that, and especially the Philistines, which we'll have more to say about in just a moment. So to summarize this kind of point before we move into really I'll say the meat of the lesson, these giant beings at one point were everywhere. They were notable in size and strength, and took control of various people groups, bringing war and death and destruction all over God's creation. The question that we're left with is, okay, so what's God going to do about this? And how God goes about solving this actually lays some foundational stuff about Jesus that we'll deal with as we move forward. Spencer, any thoughts about Nephilim stuff that we've brought up here?
One thing real quick that came to my mind. So I'm teaching Genesis right now in our adult class. I've mentioned that multiple times before. And I recently noticed a connection with this theme of the land. So particularly the Garden of Eden that I hadn't noticed before. And so I think some of what's going on here fits in within this larger theme, because you see the Nephilim in the land. So Israel is unwilling to go and take the land at first because the Nephilim are in the land. They eventually go to conquer the land, and they're meant to rid all of these inhabitants of the land, which they don't. And the entire book of Judges is the consequences of what happens when they don't. I'm preaching through Judges as well, so all of this is kind of connected in my mind. They don't root out all of the inhabitants, and so you have all of these problems that they face, and God has to deal with them by raising up these judges and so on and so forth. And what's interesting is when you go back and you read in Genesis 2, there are these verses of these 4 rivers that come from the Garden of Eden. And they're weird names. You probably skip over it when you read it. But and we don't know where these rivers are, because it doesn't perfectly fit in with what we know of the geography and the names of ancient Israel. But what we do know is all of these names of rivers are connected with rivers that surrounded Israel. So it's something that they would have been familiar with, even if it seems to me that it wasn't trying to describe an actual plot of land that perfectly nestled among these rivers, but that, hey, these are the rivers around us. If that's the case, then the promised land is being presented as the Garden of Eden. And so Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, and all this fall happens, and the garden gets to this very, very bad place that's now filled with these Nephilim that are the result of fallen humanity and fallen spiritual beings. God then raises Abraham with the purpose of going and taking the land back, taking back the Garden of Eden, which fits in the theme of new creation, that we've done a series on that as well. God's trying to bring about new creation through Israel by bringing them back to redeem the Garden of Eden that has now fallen. Israel's life is around this land. That's where their existence is built, around this promised land that they lose because of their unfaithfulness to God's plan to bring about the new creation. So other people then come and control the land, which is not God's purpose. By the way, in Genesis 2, both God and humanity are identified as gardeners to care for land. And so Israel's meant to fill this out. That doesn't work. So Jesus comes back to the land and redeems the land through his death and resurrection. In the Gospel of John, both God is presented as a gardener and Jesus as a tree that brings life Where have we heard all that language? That's all Genesis 2 language, tree of life, God is a gardener. Jesus raises from the dead, and Mary thinks he is the gardener. So connection back to Genesis chapter 2, Jesus is redeeming the land. And then if you skip to like Hebrews, the promised land becomes this metaphor for heaven. And so there's this land theme that extends throughout Scripture. And I didn't really fully understand it until in the middle of teaching it, it hit me. I was like, hey, there's something going on here. But as a part of this, you have these fallen spiritual human beings that have now taken possession of the land and have to be driven out of the land. And that's where Jack's going to go on and talk about like Moses and Joshua, who their central job is the land, right? Moses leads Israel to the land. Joshua leads the people into the land. David is king over the land. And so this theme of promised land, Garden of Eden, sits behind this theme as well. And it's a theme that we don't often realize, because I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about the land theme in this way, at least to my knowledge. And I'm not tooting my own horn and look at what I came up with, but it was one of those, I think definitely a spirit moment where I was teaching it and the spirit was like, hey, here's some insight for you on this theme that you've missed. And so I now think it's important to put some of these other themes within, I think, what is the larger theme of land, which I won't get into, but that would also be connected with maybe the largest theme, or at least of equal footing. Maybe the two largest themes in the Old Testament is land and temple, which are connected to each other.
Yeah.
God dwells in the temple within the land.
Yep.
And therefore blesses the land. When Israel loses the land, God also leaves the temple. You see that in the prophets. So those two themes are connected as well. So as Jack's talking about these things, also I would encourage you to be thinking about how they fit in with some of these larger themes that then, as Jack said, we see fulfillment in Jesus. Going back to John's gospel, again, Jesus is the temple. He's God come to tabernacle among us. So that's connected to, Jesus is connected to the land and temple theme in the Old Testament. Moses presents Jesus. Matthew presents Jesus as the new Moses. There's a Exodus connection there. Paul loves the Exodus. Luke's a little bit more focused with, I think, perhaps with Jesus as the descendant of David. So there's, that's all connected. Jesus' presentation is connected to all this. So,
yeah. Everything you said. So, you don't want to toot your own horn and all that stuff. I was actually thankful to have a professor laid that out for me in school, where he is like, pay attention to land and ground as you're going through Genesis, because those words are going to come up like 100 times. Pay attention to what's going on there. And he was doing all of OT1, the Genesis to Deuteronomy. He's like, pay attention to how this progresses as we go throughout. And so he bore some of that out. And we'll recommend, I don't know that I've recommended it enough. This information, a lot of it is borrowed, adapted, researched from Michael Heiser and his book by the same title as our card, The Unseen Realm. And he's got a number of books. And you can even see some lectures online too. I think there's one that's like 4 or 5 hours. Very good. Where he'll talk a lot about these themes in more depth than we're looking at here. But everything Spencer said, hold on to that as we're going through this, because land very much plays a huge role in this. We'll jump in with Moses here. What is God going to do about these evil things within the sacred space, the garden here, and all this? Same thing that he does with Adam and Eve. Like he can't be with this sinful stuff. It's got to go. And so when you have these conquest themes, you have some that's like destroy this completely. And I don't know how much of that we'll actually get into today, but you have destroy this or drive out. Like, this stuff cannot be here. This stuff has to go. And like you said, judges is a good consequence of not doing that, that we'll get to here in a little bit. In Genesis 1 and 2, we're shown the good creation. Think of good as everything functioning as intended, as God made it to work. And then we're introduced to this perfect creation, and then we watch that creation get corrupted. We've walked through those things. As Moses leads the people of Israel to the Promised Land, he speaks about some of these corrupting influences, the Anakim, and the mission of God in the place where they are. So this is Deuteronomy 9, 1 and 2. Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today, to go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than you, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you know, and of whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak? We do not want to rush over the word dispossess. It is the negative for the word inherit. So we're going to uninherit them from the land. We're going to re-inherit our land after we dispossess them here. And that's the word that we talked about in Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32. Those are the things that God wants to do. God doesn't just want Israel. God wants all of his creation to come back to him. He dispossessed the nations at one point after the Tower of Babel, and he wants all those things back. And Psalm 82, the very last verse, rise, O Lord, inherit. Like, we want you to bring back the nations. Deuteronomy 32, that's the hope that God's going to do this. And Moses says, guys, this is what we're doing. We're going into the Promised Land. We are pushing these things out because it does not belong to them. It belongs to God. By extension, it belongs to us. This is what our mission is. We are part of the repossessing, re-inheriting of the land. They're the agents that are going to help pull this off. So don't rush over that word. And if you're not paying attention to land, you're going to miss stuff like the possession or inheriting. And if you're not familiar, of course, with Deuteronomy 32, notice as well how much of our verses so far have come out of Deuteronomy. There's just so much in Deuteronomy that points towards, we're going into the land. Here's what we need to know in order to faithfully follow God. And here are consequences of not doing so. But alongside that, too, this is what God wants us to be doing. More than just, here are his commands. It's God's trying to do something in the world, and it's with us. Deuteronomy lays a lot of that out as it relates to these things. Later in Joshua, we're given a summary of some of Israel's conquests under the leadership of Moses. This is Joshua 12:1 and verses 4 through 6. I'm not going to read it all, but I want to read the first part of that opening verse. Now these are the kings of the land whom the people of Israel defeated and took possession of their land. And if you go through and read it, you get mentions of, like, Og, king of Bashan, is somebody that people remember. We also get Mount Hermon referenced a couple times. That is the mountain where they thought these angels made a covenant together to rebel against God, in the book of Enoch and Jubilees as well. You have that place mentioned. And it's all coming together here of Moses saying, or Joshua saying, we came in and we are pushing these things out to take possession again of the land here. God's reclaiming the creation back from the corrupting forces of the Nephilim through Israel. You have King Og noted as a remnant of the Rephaim, and he's destroyed and taken out. You have Mount Hermon reference, like I said, and a reference to, I have 1 Enoch 6:6 in your notes there, where it talks about that particular mountain. All of that is pointing towards God solving the problem, and God solving the problem through his people Israel. If they faithfully follow the things that he's asking them to do, then they're going to dispossess these corrupting forces and repossess the land on behalf of God, who wants all of the creation to come back to him. And Moses is, you mentioned Abram, that's who the covenant's given to and all of this. That's what kickstarts all this. But Moses is that first individual we see going to battle and start taking these things down. And again, To spoil it a little bit, because we'll deal with Jesus and the disciples and all of this in a later lesson more specifically, but Jesus is presented as Moses in Matthew, as well as other places. You have them connected. This is another connecting piece, how Jesus is like Moses, because he's going to battle these things too, and bring about that ultimate possession of creation. Any thoughts on Moses before we jump into Joshua here?
No. Just again, thinking about Moses' connection to land would be my addition, and and even tabernacle. David, temple, which is, I said that, those themes are connected together in the Old Testament and connected to Jesus in the New Testament in a multitude of different ways. So again, just how these themes are connected and interwoven together. And Joshua is next. And so that is definitely a continuation of the connection to land.
Yeah. So I only have a little bit here to highlight about Joshua. It's not that there isn't more that we could look at. But I want to highlight this particular section. This is out of Joshua 11. Joshua is one of those books that I feel like we read in the same way we read Job. We know the first couple chapters, and then like stuff happens in the middle, and then we know the end. And that's how we read that book. Joshua is the same way. You have Jericho and all of this, and then you skip to the end of choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. And all the stuff in the middle is they had these battles and this battle, and then they divided up the land, and this group got that bit and this group got that bit over here. All of that is God fulfilling his end of the deal. Like, this is the covenant. They're in the promised land. God said, this is how I'm going to do this. It's very important. But yeah, it's a little hard to read when we're going, how many people and what section are they getting? Okay, So we skip over a lot of the middle. And in Joshua 11, 21 and 22, we get this. It's just a little blip in the narrative, but important. And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza and Gath and in Ashdod did some remain. We have some very specific battles against these things in Joshua, but here's the summary text, the conquering text. Devoted them to destruction. None of them remained, except for the few that remained, which is always a funny way of. It just reads funny to me. Of we completely destroyed them all. There was nothing left except for the ones that were left. It's just a weird way of writing that, but. What we get here is Joshua and the people of Israel pretty nearly do everything they were told to do. They got rid of most all of them. They did a lot of this legwork. What Moses started, Joshua and the people of Israel, when they come in, they pretty well finish except for a few places. We get here hill country. You would build on hills because more fortified, easier to attack from above, number one. But there's also something to be said for mountains as sacred spaces. I actually have notes for that. I don't know if we'll ever cover it as a lesson. Maybe it becomes an article, not sure. But mountains, high places are very important. And so you would expect to see these things there as well from a spiritual reason, not just a logistical reason when it comes to warfare. You also have an individual mentioned in Joshua in Arba, not in the text that we just read, but in around that area, where you have someone who's got tremendous reputation. Earlier in what we read from, Joshua 12, you have individuals who are noted for, these giants who are noted, and they're, Joshua says to them, you know these things, you're familiar with these things, you've experienced them a lot. They have reputation. Like, these are not random things that kind of exist out in the world, just a few of them. There are a lot of them with great reputation and do a lot of leading and all this. And even still, Joshua and the people of Israel take them out. Only in, the text says, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. All three of those are Philistine cities. And those Philistine cities are where the narrative is going to pick up on these things again. Because we don't encounter any more of these giant being things until we get to David from here. With the exception of Caleb Joshua saying, up here in this hill country, there's, some Anakim up there, whoever wants it, it's yours. And Caleb says, I'll take it. So we have a little bit of a mention, but Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod point us to, with Moses, they're kind of everywhere. Joshua and the people of Israel come into the promised land, shove these things out, destroy these things, and they're left in a remnant. There's a remnant of these things in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, these Philistine cities. And when we come into the narrative surrounding David and Goliath, as well as some other places during David's reign, what we see is the Philistines are the ones that have these things, and the Philistines are going to lose these things too. And God's going to finish the job of taking the giants out here through David. Anything to add about Joshua or land or Jesus and all of this here?
Well, to me, there's an important, for churches, there's an important theological concept in the driving out of all of the inhabitants. Mm-hmm. And I know on this Sunday, I'm in Judges, and we're talking about the story of Gideon. Gideon begins with, God's like, well, the first thing you have to do is you have to destroy the idols, the altars to Baal. You cut down the Asherah poles, and then you construct a new altar to Yahweh. Like the start of Israel's salvation is destroying the idols. And the point that I'm going to make on Sunday to our church is that so Gideon also doesn't understand Israelite history. He's like, God, why have you allowed this to happen to us? And the verse before, an angel of the Lord, a prophet of God came and said, this is why it's happening to you. And God prophesied about it in Deuteronomy. He's like, when you go into the land, if you don't do that, then if you don't follow me, then this is what's going to happen to you, right? So that's sitting behind that. The point that I'm going to make on Sunday with the Gideon narrative, or at least the beginning of it, is that not only is it important for us as churches to know our history accurately and not have a rose-tinted glass view of the past like Gideon seemed to have, but that then has to move us to destroy the idols of the past. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the idols in our Church of Christ history. But our theme as a church for the year is cultivating culture. And in Judges, it's cultivating a culture for the future. I've got a book coming out on culture, because I think almost every problem you name that a church has, I think a lot of it comes back to the church's culture. Not that churches with great culture do everything right, but they've set the foundation to be able to deal with problems when they do arise in a healthy way. Because they're going to arise, and the way that you deal with them a lot of the time is determined by your culture. And to develop a good culture, which Israel never did, and that's kind of what I'm arguing in Judges. Judges is the example of a bad culture, because over and over and over again, when a good leader died, Israel returned back.
Yeah.
And because there was a bad culture in Israel that can't be, a good leader can do a lot of good things, but there's a limitation there when the culture's bad. And I think that's true with churches Israel has to drive out the evil. They have to destroy the idols and the false gods in order to move forward. And they never fully do that. And there's a lot that could be said about churches needing to root out the evil that's in their culture, to destroy the idols and the false gods of the past, to establish a culture that's able to move into the future and not be like Israel that keeps perpetuating the same problem after the same problem after the same problem. You notice a lot of churches that have a lot of churches in my experience that have a lot of problems. It's the same problems repeating itself because it's the same culture. And I'm going to save that for when we talk. We're going to have an episode on church culture when, at some point. But I also want that to be in our mind. Like there's some the application here of what's going on, and we do things similar to Israel in our churches. Just the giants are different, but they're still present. The evil beings trying to influence the church is still present. We'll talk about that more when we get to like Paul, but there's a similar calling for the church, I think. And so thinking a little bit about application there. Okay, with that being said, let's move on now to David. He's the last Old Testament guy I think we're going to talk about in this episode. We had Moses, we had Joshua, now we have David.
Yeah, there are some prophets that will mention these things, but the job of battling them in this, we'll say in this form, is over with David. So Moses starts it, Joshua does a lot of the work here as they're moving into the promised land. David's going to finish the job there. In the kingdom of Israel, under Saul and David's reign, we're introduced to the remnants of the Rephaim that remained in the area, speaking specifically from 1 Samuel 17 about Goliath of Gath. He's the Philistine champion, and all of this makes sense because the last time we talked about these things narratively in Joshua, they're hanging out in the Philistine cities. Like, this is where we expect these things to be. We're not surprised. We're disappointed when we read this, but we're not surprised because they didn't fully rid these things, and so they're still hanging out there. And David comes in as a young man to take them out. Later on, as Saul's reign ends and David's begins, we get this later on in David's reign. This is 2 Samuel starting in verse 15 through 22. So I'm not going to read all of that, but it is there in the show notes. But I do want to read the final verse because it goes into detail about a few individuals still dealing with Philistine, because that's where we expect these things to be, because Joshua and Israel handled the other ones. So we expect them to be in Philistia with the Philistines. Verse 22, these four were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David, by the hand of his servants. We get an ending to these things in the days of David. The Nephilim, their ancestors, the products of evil supernatural intervention, they meet their end. No longer would they be able to physically lead nations and devour others. The land was free from these imposing creatures, at least in physical form. I'm stressing the physical form part because they don't seem to cease to exist. We will talk about that as our last kind of part here in a moment. But two, and Spencer mentioned this, we'll talk about this more when we get to Paul, but the powers and all of this, that has physical influence or influence in the world that we are living in. And those things are still very much present, and they were still present here. They were present when those things were walking around, the thing behind the scene, but they were also present after the fact. And the Bible actually speaks to this, as does the intertestamental writings, as do the intertestamental writings. But the Bible will actually give us some thoughts on, this is what they think happened to these things, and they still had some kind of influence. It's actually very interesting. But what I want us to get here, as we kind of hit this little closing point before we deal with the next part, Moses, Joshua, and David, we've already made mentions of how Jesus is connected to those individuals when we come into the Gospels or the New Testament writings. This is another layer to all of that that part of Jesus's redeeming of the land is connected to his finishing off I guess we'll say the products of these things, or what these things persist as after their death. I don't know. That makes no sense to anybody. It will in just a minute. But Jesus is connected to these things in his warfare. Coming to defeat these things is part of what it's going to take to redeem creation. Because remember, Jesus isn't just solving the Genesis 3 problem of here comes sin into the world, and now we got to get rid of sin, and so he's going to have to die and all this. Yeah, that's true, and he's going to do that. But Jesus is also solving the Genesis 6 problem of these, the influence of evil as it goes throughout the world, and the Genesis 11 problem of the creation being dispossessed and God wanting it all back to him. Jesus is solving all of those things, and we see that in, at least partially, in this pattern here, that he's like Moses and Joshua and David in the conquering of these things so that the nations can be possessed again, re-inherited by Yahweh. Any thoughts on any of that stuff? I tried to summarize and bring together all the land stuff because it does matter big time.
Yeah, and like we've said, we'll dive into this a little more when we get into the New Testament.
Yeah,
I did forget to mention the primary. I mentioned the connection between Jesus and Moses, Exodus theme, Jesus and David. Jesus is king. He's the kingly representative that comes in the line of David, right? That's throughout the New Testament. Joshua, in Hebrew, Yeshua, which means one who saves or something like that. Mm-hmm. The Greek equivalent to Yeshua is Jesus, which is Jesus. Jesus' name is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew Joshua.
Yep.
Though, to be historically correct, as I like to be, there's going to be some Aramaic in the middle of that, because Jesus would have spoken Aramaic. His name would have been the Aramaic equivalent to the Hebrew Joshua. And then when the New Testament gets written in Greek, it then gets translated again into the probably more of the Greek equivalent of the Aramaic, which is the equivalent of the Hebrew, which a reader would have known. Like that wouldn't have been something that was hidden from the average reader, would have been able to easily make that connection. But Jesus becomes the savior, like Joshua was savior, and like, well, even in Judges, the judges are called deliverers, which is the word for savior, which is derived from the same root that we get the name Joshua. So the judges come after in the same vein as Joshua does there. I also want to mention, we mention, and there's more of this in the notes, some of the intertestamental literature. We'll dive into that even more, particularly like the Enochic tradition. And so I don't forget to say it later when what books like the book of Enoch does is it comes to show the way that Jews came to understand, or at least some Jews came to understand these passages in the Old Testament that we're talking about. And I say some Jews because you can't assume that every Jew believed what Enoch said. You can't even necessarily assume that most Jews believed, or that most Jews had the time to think about such things. That's something that we sometimes forget. It was the prerogative of like the scholars, in essence, of the first century, Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, priests who dealt with texts, to sit around and think about, what do these mean? The average Jew was just worried about surviving another day and probably didn't care about most of these things, and probably didn't have an in-depth understanding of a lot of these things because they more cared about putting food on the table. It's kind of similar to today, right? Professors and preachers have the time to sit around and think about these theological things that the person in the pew typically doesn't have the time to do because they're worried about more pressing issues than, which is fine. I mean, that's why I think we need educated people in our churches and in our universities and all of that. I say that to say the book of the book of Enoch is the way that Jews come to understand these passages. It's not how, or at least to the depth in which these passages would have been understood early on. This is the development of an understanding of the spiritual realm is something that develops within Judaism. So you've got some of these discussions, but I'm not sure that an original audience would have understood in depth that there's just these things are God wants us to go destroy. They're evil. We are God's chosen people. That was probably the extent of it. And then a deeper theology develops over time. And the book of Enoch, it's almost impossible to deny, has a very deep influence on the New Testament. And so that's why, because some people would say, well, you can't, and to some extent it's true, you can't go to some of this intertestamental literature and just assume that it's correct. And this is and so you kind of have to hold it with a grain of salt while understanding that you can see the influence in all over the New Testament. And I use the language of the influence of the Enochic tradition because just because you see some of this behind the scenes does not mean that a particular author has even read the book of Enoch, because the book of Enoch comes out of a way of thinking among Jews.
Sure.
Or at least,
yeah,
it's assuming that the author was a part of a community of people that thought similarly and expresses those then in writing. And so it's kind of like, Jack could read a book by somebody that expresses an idea that I hold. It doesn't mean that I got it from that book, or I even know of the book or know of the author.
Yeah.
But if we run in similar veins of thinking and have access to similar other resources, we might draw the same conclusions, though we never directly overlap. And we'll have more to say on that, I'm sure, when we get to the New Testament. But that was on my mind, and I didn't want to skip over that because there's it's not always like a one-for-one relationship. Like the way that these traditions work is a very in-depth thing that we don't fully understand. And so you have to hold on to these kind of lightly because we don't understand the way that these traditions worked originally, because oral society and who knew what, who had access to what. There's just no way for us to know in the 21st century what that looked like 2,000 plus years ago. But these are ideas that develop, probably weren't there from the very beginning. They develop within Judaism and have influence on the New Testament. And so what Jack's doing is he's kind of drawing together the way that these themes seem to connect, bringing in all of these different parts of the tradition. And to me, the last thing I'll say on that is just, to me, that's important I think it's important for preachers, because I would warn against getting one of these texts and just immediately saying, this is what it means, and go to spiritual realm stuff. Though you might be right, that was a later understanding. And I would say, let's start with what would it have originally meant to its audience who didn't have an in-depth understanding of spiritual things, and then work from there to maybe what it comes to mean among Jews and the way the theme even gets shown in the New Testament. But I always caution against, read Joshua and you might want to get to Jesus, but you got to do the work to get there. You can't just jump to Jesus and be like, oh, Jesus is the new Joshua. It's like, well, yes, but you're denying the original meaning of the text. You're probably denying the meaning of the text of Jesus as well, and the thousands of years in between that are able to make that connection. And so don't be lazy.
That's like a lot of
what I'm saying.
The prophecies, especially within Matthew and stuff. It's like, well, yeah, it means that about Jesus, but also like it meant something different immediately there. So yes, we are we're doing this with the benefit of hindsight of being able to go, okay, we have Enoch, we have the New Testament, we can look backwards with the forwards interpretation of those things. So.
I think I think it was Tim at North Mac. I think he's the one that I heard say one time that you have to preachers have to earn the right to preach topically or something.
See, I had the president at school said that to me. This is funny because this could be an oral tradition thing. Who'd you hear this from and who'd it come? But yeah. No, I think I heard
it from Tim. I think I heard it from Tim Lewis.
Yeah.
And I always liked that because you have the point is you have to put in the work, which is generally over time in your ministry. It's not coming out of school. You probably need to preach everything exegetically, and then maybe at some point you can get into some topical stuff, because when you do a topic, you have multiple texts in their original context that meant different things, and you're pulling them together in a theological way, which you can do, but you have to put in all of the legwork, which if you're preaching every week, you probably don't have the time to do right out of school. I know that my study time becomes less and less, I feel like, every year. Not because I don't put a lot of work into it, but because there's so many things that I have come to understand now that I don't have to do the legwork with anymore. Because especially with New Testament stuff, because I spend so much time in Gospels, Second Temple Judaism, that kind of a thing. There's a lot of assumptions that I already know. Yeah. And I already know what Matthew's trying to do. And it doesn't mean I don't read a commentary or listen to other people, but what that allows me to, you're not starting at zero. And then what that allows me to do is read different perspectives. So I could be like, hey, I want to read a feminist perspective on Matthew this time, because I've laid the groundwork where now I can start thinking about the text in very, very unique and specific ways. I can't get to that from ground zero. Right. And so that just I think an important caution in what we're presenting and how you may use it and stuff that our listeners might be using it for. Anyway, that was probably more than I needed to say, so I'll turn it back over to you.
That being said, we're going to look at Ezekiel and Isaiah, a couple prophets, and ultimately what these things come to mean. These have very immediate, like you said, the Jews that this is being written to are just concerned about, when do we get home? When does this stop? Because we hate this exile and everything. But there will be some language that's used here that we've seen already, that we understand, how those thoughts develop, and so we're looking ahead about that.
One more comment, just real quick, and I know Jack and I wouldn't exactly land on the same page on this, but if the Old Testament comes to its final form during the Persian period, so late exile, even if we accept a traditional writing, if it all gets pulled together during that time period, which I think there's good evidence for, which would also mean it got slightly edited during that time period, what you would have is later Jews that have a more developed understanding of the spiritual realm, maybe even reworking some of the language in these texts to make these connections that might have not been there explicitly originally, which is another layer to the tradition to think about, of their later Jews seeing connections that earlier Jews didn't see, like even what Jack and I are doing and what New Testament people are doing. And so when these are being edited into their final form, you might get they might be edited in a way to make these connections more explicit. And not that they weren't there before, and not that the Spirit didn't. Yeah. And so on and so forth. The Spirit can work through an editor as much as the Spirit can work through an original author. I think sometimes we get,
Luke. Like
if yes, that's what Luke did. If God can work through a writer, why can't he work through somebody editing the writing? And I think at least with the Old Testament, we have to accept that. These texts were around so long, you're telling me that nobody ever at any point edited them together to form I just find that hard to believe. And it was probably later because that's when writing became more important during the Persian period in particular. So that's another layer.
All that stuff being considered and laid out here. A couple of the major prophets here. So in the major prophets, we get discussions of Israel's current exile, justice that God will bring for them upon their enemies, and the expectation of Israel's future hope. Okay, but again, like with Moses, Joshua, David, and all of this, in this vein specifically, too, like Jesus is going to mirror them in a lot of ways. This is another layer to all of that. So we can't talk about future hope of what Jesus is going to do in redeeming the creation and all of this without understanding why the creation needs redemption and the stuff that's there that needs to be gotten rid of. So the prophets do have, at least later or whatever, this comes to mind for readers. In those discussions, the prophets, Ezekiel and Isaiah specifically, use imagery that's meant to take us back to the Garden of Genesis 3, much like Peter and Jude take us back to Genesis events in their condemnation of false teachers, but there's also spiritual implication for those things too in their books. These Old Testament passages in the major prophets give us better understanding of events that have taken place in the divine council. So I just have these separated into blocks. Ezekiel 28, 1 through 10. This is a prophecy against an evil king. We're talking about a real nation and a real man here, not a divine being of any sort, though he claims to be one, but that's normal king stuff, claiming to be a descendant of the gods or a god yourself. In describing the destruction that will occur to Tyre, the nation of Tyre, God uses an example of a rebellion that takes place at the time of Genesis 3, and this is in verses 11 through 19 of Ezekiel 28. Cherub and mountain are both used here, which is very the garden of God, and the cherub guarding the entrance and all of this language. It's worth your time to read this section. And I'll say, this is not just me either, this is Heiser discussing this, that some will read this and go, oh, it's talking about Adam. The problem is, there is some problem with that. He's nowhere described as being egotistically, this is Heiser's quote, egotistically enamored by his own beauty and splendor, nor was he ever named as being a cherub, which in Ezekiel 28, 11 through 19, this event that's very clearly Garden of God language, this individual is called a cherub, or this divine being that falls. It's not Adam. So we're talking about some spiritual being, at least one, that is going to be in rebellion here in all of this. Now, Ezekiel's purpose is just to use that as an illustration for this nation that's going to drop here, which is what Israel's concerned about. When is this going to be over? God's going to exercise justice against these evil places. But all of the garden imagery, all of the spiritual imagery, the fall and cherub references and all of this just bring us back into that spiritual realm sort of place. And Isaiah is going to do something similar as far as language goes. So this Ezekiel imagery is picked up by Isaiah in a taunt, a comparison to something else against the king of Babylon. So we're going to talk about another real king in all of this, and a real nation, but we're going to use as for illustrative purposes in Isaiah reference to some spiritual realm stuff. Whether the Jewish people at this time really understood all of that, what they're hearing is, okay, this will be over eventually. God's going to do something about it. And that's the point. So here's what we read in Isaiah 14. This is 9 through 11. Here the king of Babylon is said to be sent to the realm of the dead, Sheol. This is where the dead go. where the dead spirits. That's how the ESV translates it. I'm pretty sure other translations have it as shade, which is also it's a very Greek thing to have shades. Ghost is not far off as kind of an idea, because we're familiar with that, at least from like movies and culture and stuff. That's what shades would be, disembodied spirits, that kind of idea. So the king of Babylon is sent to the realm of the dead, where the dead spirits, which is in Hebrew the word Rephaim, which earlier in the Old Testament we didn't have translated. It just was the word Rephaim for us. And it was those giants. We've already seen how those names are connected. For some reason in Isaiah, it's translated into dead spirits or shades, or these things that are in the realm of the dead, that are in Sheol. He has become like them, punished as an unjust ruler. This punishment description is followed up with cosmic language in a further comparison to the king's destruction. So this is Isaiah 14, 12 through 15, the next section there. We have morning star language in this section. We saw that in Job. We noted that like 4 episodes ago, in connection with the sons of God. God compares the king of Babylon in this section to one who has fallen from heaven. That's a quote out of this section. So here's what we get. We have the king of Tyre and the king of Babylon in Ezekiel and then Isaiah. Both of them are compared to these spiritual things that got too proud of themselves and tried to elevate themselves further than they were supposed to, and God dealt with them. And just like God dealt with those things, God's going to deal with these physical nations and these physical kings too. That's the point of those. But in both of these sections, we're given language that takes us back to the garden, with mountain and cherub and jewels, those words being used. And in both places, we have a divine being that is cast to the ground or to the dust, language that reminds us of the serpent and some other things there out of Genesis 3. Not only do these sections highlight a little more information for us about divine counsel, rebellion, and punishment, but it clues us into some interesting ideas about, and this is the title of the section, where demons come from. Spencer and I have said it before. You get into the New Testament, and there are a few things that we go, whoa, where did this come from? Like demons, where did those things come from? Synagogues, by the way. We just kind of go into the New Testament and go, these things are everywhere. Where do those come from? There's just a lot of stuff that we take for granted informationally when we come into the New Testament and go, we really didn't get a lot of info on how this stuff came to be. Because a lot of that information is, again, intertestamental. All this development in between. When we come into the New Testament, it's there. And if we aren't familiar with the intertestamental period, that's fine. Because again, if you're just trying to make it through each day, you don't really care about that sort of stuff, which is fair. But that time and the writings during that time that we have help illuminate some of those things. This is true as well of where do demons come from? This is some later Jewish thought at the very least. 1 Enoch 15, verses 8 and 9. It's in the show notes, but we'll read it here as we work towards our wrap-up. And when they and all their children have battled with each other, and when they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them for 70 generations underneath the rocks of the ground, until the day of their judgment and of their consummation, until the eternal judgment is concluded. But now the giants who are born from the union of the spirits and the flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, because their dwelling shall be upon the earth and inside the earth. Evil spirits have come out of their bodies, because from the day that they were created from the holy ones, they became the watchers. Their first origin is the spiritual foundation. They will become evil upon the earth and shall be called evil spirits. So for later Jewish thought, all these demons and stuff are connected to the offspring of Genesis 6, the Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim. Basically, they die. They continue to exist on the earth following that death, on the earth and inside the earth, according to Enoch tradition there. This language is picked up in a few places. Isaiah does talk about the spirits, dead spirits being from these things, as we just read. Peter will talk about these things being chained in all of this, which is also mentioned in Enoch. Whether he's familiar with, like you said, whether he's directly read these things or if it's something he knows because of its being passed down. He seems to allude to it, whether he knows that or not. And Paul, of course, writes about the spiritual warfare, rulers against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Like they have this understanding of these things exist, continue to exist in some kind of form. I didn't include these verses. When Jesus walking on the water and they go, "Oh, it's a ghost," is an interesting little. Is that just a thing that they thought about normally? Is it just something that they had in their head? Maybe you can throw some more out about that.
We can dive into that a little more when we get to the New Testament.
Sure.
Just your fun fact: the Greek word there is phantasmos, from which we get the word phantom. So that translation is, because I've had people ask me, it's like, well, so is it a ghost? Like what? Well, I'm like, well, I mean, the word is where we get the word phantom. So it's that. I mean, that is the concept there. The question, as you said, becomes like, what are they drawing on in their thought process of what? Because something that you have to understand is it's like when we say when I say like phantom ghost, I'm drawing on the imagery of like the Conjuring franchise, which is the point of understanding the context, right?
Yeah.
You have to. So I'm writing about it in 2024, and someone discovers it 2,000 years later. You need to know the Conjuring to understand where I'm coming from, because we've got this whole genre of movies that's the idea of phantom, demon, ghost, and when we're using the language, that's a lot of the times what we're thinking of, right? Just in common thought of, there's a ghost in my house. What are you drawing on? Well, the horror franchise in film, and that illustrates the point of thinking of when they call Jesus a phantom or a ghost, what tradition are they drawing on to understand what it means for someone to be a ghost? And we can dive into that more when we get to the New Testament. But they're drawing on some kind of tradition that understands the possibility of some kind of spirit entity that is manifesting in a physical form.
Yeah.
Which they should be able to, because we have angels that do that all throughout the biblical tradition. So it's not, but they don't identify it as an angel. So it's not, an angel is a spiritual being that manifests physically, but from God, or is God. So I'll go back to the Gideon episode. Might be what's called a theophany. So it's not a separate being, but it's God himself who manifests in a physical form, because it's called an angel of the Lord in the text. But Gideon, after speaking to it, says, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." And then God says, "Don't worry, you won't die." Well, that's a reference back to Exodus, where Moses says, anyone who sees God face to face will surely die. So Gideon seems to think that what he saw was not another being speaking for God, but saw a physical manifestation of God himself, which is where Jacob wrestles with an angel, but then name gets changed to Israel, wrestled with God. You've got something like that going on there. So the Old Testament has language to understand spiritual manifesting in physical form in some way or another, but that gets developed far beyond angel and theophany that we see in the Old Testament, as evidenced in the intertestamental literature, which, as Jack said, brings up the question of what are they pulling from to understand Jesus as a ghost or a phantom. So we'll get to that I don't know why balloons just.
Balloons everywhere. They loved your point.
I've got to figure that out. But there you go.
The point of all of this is, for Jewish thought, at least eventually, and going into the New Testament, all demon possession, all of this sort of stuff, like they would see that as these are the spirit remnants of these things that existed in the days of the flood and Moses and Joshua and David defeating and all of this. That's maybe why they're trying to possess individuals. These spirits are trying to become embodied again. They just want to have control over creation. And everything that we see these things doing within the New Testament is anti God's good created order. That's what they were about anyway. Like that's what they're doing. They're causing chaos, and Jesus removes that chaos and brings order. Which again, that's what that is. Moses, Joshua, and David, as they're casting out the giants, are bringing order to the chaos, reclaiming the land, redeeming all of this stuff, because they're pushing out the warfare and the fighting and the conquer and all this stuff, and saying, no, this is what God desires. We'll have more to say about this when we get in the New Testament, but Jesus casting out the demons, the apostles also doing that, following. It's continuing that pattern of thought of Jesus is going to finish this off. And as the church continues to move and go through, the kingdom is repossessing all of these things, taking it all back by getting rid of the influence of all of this and undoing the problems of Genesis 3, Genesis 6, and Genesis 11. I'll close with my little summary thing here, and then you do whatever you want to do from there. The Nephilim and their descendants are repeatedly said to be beings that should never have existed and whose existence brought pain and warfare to the world. Through the text we've read from Genesis to Ezekiel, we see God's successful destruction of these beings in the heavenly realm and on the earth through Israel and under the leadership of Moses, Joshua, and David. Again, we are reminded of God's working at all times to rid the evil in the world and our participation in that effort as people in God's kingdom. And again, as we move closer and closer to the New Testament, which won't be the next episode, but soon we'll see our participation in those things. So that's all I've got there. Go for it.
That's I don't have anything to add. I think I've said plenty. That's not exactly related, but will hopefully set us up better to think about what's going on in the New Testament when we see some of this language continue in, as Jack mentioned, new and unique ways in the New Testament that's not seen in the Old Testament, right? There's new things that are happening, and understanding how we get there. There's this development. But that is the episode. Thank you all for joining us and working with us on our first video episode, and my balloons flying everywhere. That's now turned off. I think it's a little late now, but that's been dealt with. But thank you for joining us. Make sure to check us out on our website, thinkingtheologically.org, where not only do we have these podcast videos and audio there, but some additional content in the form of articles that we semi-regularly post on the website. Check out now, especially our YouTube channel, Thinking Theologically, where our podcasts, hopefully from now going forward, as well as all of the interviews, will be posted there as well. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. You can find Jack and I individually on Facebook. You can find me on everything else. And I would encourage you, when you find Thinking Theologically on any of those social media, to like or follow us, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're there and watching this as well. That helps us out to get those followers and subscribers. If nothing else, then to let us figure out whether or not what we're doing is working and effective and anybody is listening. So make sure to do that. If you have any questions or comments, if you have concerns or criticisms that you want to give to Jack, not to me, you can email us at strongchurchministries@gmail.org. And thank you for tuning in.